Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining Foley and Lardner for part one of the Monetizing Campus Energy Assets webinar series. If you have any questions about today's topic, we invite you to type them into the Q&A box, which is located on the left side of your screen. We will be answering questions throughout the program, and any questions not addressed will be discussed during our Microsoft Teams Q&A following this presentation. If you experience any technical difficulties with the webinar platform, please refresh your browser or see the webcast help guide on the bottom of your screen, which is designated with a question mark icon. As a final note, there is a short survey located on the right side of your screen, and we would greatly appreciate your feedback on today's webinar. And now I will turn it over to Darin Lowder, who will begin today's program.
Hello and welcome to Foley and Lardner's first in a three-part series of webinars on monetizing campus energy assets. So today we will be giving an overview and using an example that the panelists have some specific experience with related to Duquesne University and their efforts. We have a tremendous panel today to speak about this. We want to talk a little bit about context as we get ready to kick off. So during the past year, higher education and healthcare campuses have really struggled financially through the consequences of the COVID pandemic. Third-party developers, financing providers, campus officials are exploring innovative partnerships to shift risks and open up new sources of capital and operational expertise to monetize those energy assets on campuses across the country. And I would note that some of the recent real challenges and tragedies that we're seeing unfold in Texas due to some extreme weather and energy resource redundancies or lack of redundancies is really highlighting what some of the challenges are in operating complex energy systems. So today, our exceptional panel of experts have dealt with these types of projects in a range of settings. Each of them played a key role in recent innovative energy project partnership at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. The Duquesne recently entered into a 40-year energy services contract, which monetized its energy assets and involved a sale of those assets under a public-private type partnership structure. They outsourced those utility services to Clearway Energy, allowing the university to really focus and reinvest in its core mission. Discussion of this transaction to explore from a pretty high level the value that these transactions present to all of the parties, to talk about some of the recent trends in public-private partnership transactions at higher education and healthcare institutions, and as well as some key commercial points in those transactions. And then we'll wrap up with a discussion of some key risks, some best practices to help facilitate these transactions, which can be complex and stretch out over sometimes an extended period of time, and focusing on how these institutions can unlock the economic value and future-proof their operations as operational resilience, sustainability, and modernization of their infrastructure really become critical. So we'll talk about transaction practicalities and considerations, stakeholder engagement, some key challenges and success factors in forging those productive long-term partnerships. So our panelists today include myself. I'm a partner at Foley and Lardner and worked on mostly renewable energy transactions, alternative energy transactions, as well as campus facilities like the Duquesne project with combined heat and power, district heating and cooling, similar systems like that. I work both on the developer and the financing side. And we'll have each of the panelists introduce themselves as soon as we walk through the agenda. So Samir Qureshi from Clearway Energy, Inc., is another panelist. Stephen Auton-Smith, Managing Director at Ernst Young Infrastructure Advisors, and Russell Grunebach at the Associate Vice President for Finance and Business at Duquesne University. And again, each of these individuals played a key role in the Duquesne project. So as our agenda, we'll be talking about what the value proposition is on the outsourcing energy infrastructure. We'll discuss some recent private partnership type structures and how those deals came about, what they look like. We'll talk through the Duquesne experience with the interconnection of their district heating and cooling system with an adjacent system, how that came together, what the upfront payment structure looks like in these deals, what some of the agreements are and the basic deal structures, and then some comparisons about how those various structures play into each other and interact with the stakeholders process. And then finally, how those risks come about. So Samir, actually, before we get to this, can each of you give us a brief introduction, each of our panelists? Samir, we'll start with you, and then Stephen and Russell in that order.
Sure. Thanks, Darin. So, my name is Samir Qureshi. I'm with Clearway, based out of New York City. My background working at Clearway, or its predecessor, name it, NRG, the energy space, working in corporate finance, project finance, tax-exempt finance, and M&A across most energy asset classes. So I'm more of a finance banker type. And in the last few years, my focus has been more on the distributed generation side of our business with this campus energy projects and a focus on essentially financing and structuring of these transactions.
Thanks, Samir. Stephen?
Hi, everyone. I'm Stephen Auton-Smith. I'm a managing director in EY in New York. I lead our business in energy and environmental infrastructure in the US, which encompasses decentralized generation, transmission, microgrids, et cetera, et cetera. So we were the financial advisors to the university on this particular transaction and advise a whole range of universities and other campuses across the US on similar deals.
Great. And Russ?
Good afternoon now. My name is Russ Grunebach, and I was a member of the Duquesne team, a multidisciplinary team that engineered this transaction. I would say, as by way of background, Duquesne is about a 9,000 student campus with 47 buildings on 48 acres. And this transaction, along with several others, was under the general guise of focusing on our core. So back in 2011, we sold a radio station. That was technically our first monetization transaction, kind of all under that same idea of focusing on core and spinning off things that were not core to our campus mission.
Thank you. You learn something new every day. I did not know about the radio station spinoff. That's very cool. All right. So Russ and Samir, what are we hearing from the market, from the rating agencies, from analysts about the value of these deals?
Samir?
Maybe I'll take that first. I mean, no, I think, well, generally, rating agencies have been viewing this positively, and for numerous reasons. One, the age of assets, a lot of campuses has gotten, to the end of life, and a lot of them have to be renewed. That was not, by the way, the case in Duquesne. Duquesne has really pristine assets that we but from a rating agency standpoint, you have universities that are looking at significant capital dollars going towards non-core items that are, very important in their nature in terms of what they provide to the campus. And secondly, one of the larger macro things you're also seeing in the U.S. is obviously a march towards carbon neutrality by the customers of these universities, really the young folks in the country. And that is kind of a goal that no one really knows how they're going to get to ultimately either. So you do need a party alongside with you that's experienced both in terms of renewing your infrastructure, but doing that under the context or the ultimate goal of achieving carbon neutrality while making sure, to Darin's point, that the lights stay on, just because of how critical these assets are relative to providing power and heating and cooling to these campuses. Russ, anything you want to add there?
Okay, I would add that this transaction started as a desire by the university to be able to tap its excess steam capacity. So we went into this not even contemplating a complete sale of our physical assets of our plant. We were just looking to monetize a decent amount of excess steam that we had capability to produce in our power plant. Those discussions continued into the larger transaction, which we have a rating from Moody's, or a review of the transaction from Moody's, that they quote unquote largely credit neutral. Moody's liked the upfront cash inflow to the university. They also recognized, as we did in negotiating the transaction, that there were resiliencies and efficiencies that we were able to gain by partnering with Clearway. Who was Duquesne University to run its own power plant? We had a great staff. I'm not saying anything badly about our staff, and they did a great job, and our plant, as Samir mentioned, was well maintained. But the reality is, if one or two of those key individuals left us for whatever reason, we didn't have a bench. We're not an energy company, so we recognized in negotiating this transaction that maybe we didn't have a business running a power plant. The other thing that became apparent in negotiation with Clearway was that there were these efficiencies. In other words, they could more efficiently staff their local assets, kind of sharing staff and or overtime issues, things of that nature, became much more efficient for them versus what we were able to do as a standalone. And then there's just the resiliency and efficiency in the plant itself. Not an engineer, but there's this concept of N+1. If you're running a boiler, you have to have a boiler in reserve if the boiler that you're operating goes down. So Clearway's plant had to have an N+1, and Duquesne's plant had to have an N+1. And by connecting the two plants, simple math is you only need 1+1. You don't need a +2 plants. So Clearway, or Moody's and S&P liked all of those unique benefits, I would say, to our deal, where we actually interconnected our plant with Clearway's plant.
Excellent. Thank you. So, Stephen, can you talk through a little bit of the value proposition? We just heard from Russ that one of those had to do with kind of future-proofing and staffing, the depth of their own bench in terms of potential resilience or what would happen if they lost those key individuals. So that makes sense. But we haven't really touched on the economics yet. So can you walk through some of the other value propositions apparent in these transactions?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think a number of key points for Duquesne, but I think the point that I would make is that each university has a slightly different context, both in terms of financial stability on the ground and in terms of aspiration. And I think what we're seeing is a number of different transaction models evolve, which reflect those differing priorities. So the performance aspects that Russ talked about, resilience, cost effectiveness, efficiency, are clearly a key part of any reason to do a public-private partnership. But there are other drivers as well. So service transformation objectives can be a key driver for some of these transactions, and that is about deploying significant capital to modernize, which is either functionally obsolete, has reached the end of its useful life, or has reached the level of reliability at which point the university it's kind of passed beyond the university's ability to remedy. And without embarrassing anyone, there are names on that list that you'll see on the slide that have reached that point. So therefore, bringing in private sector expertise and private sector capital can achieve that modernization and transformation. And when you layer in decarbonization objectives, be that demand side management, energy efficiency, or low carbon fuel sources, et cetera, then the need for that expertise grows and grows, which has achieved a lot of press attention, is the monetization payment. And what a number of these universities are doing is using the energy transaction as a way of financing an upfront cash receipt without issuing new debt. And if you're a state institution, maybe you have a debt cap. If you're a private institution, maybe you want to reserve your debt capacity for other things. So when you look at Iowa or Ohio State or Idaho or even Duquesne, there is an of a financing transaction in there. Now in Duquesne, that was primarily around monetizing the value of the efficiencies and the surplus capacity that the plant had. But also it took account of Clearway's position of the asset. Clearly the asset had value and was sold, so that yielded a monetization payment. Now in Ohio State and Iowa, the assets aren't necessarily being sold, and therefore the play is really about borrowing money from the private sector at a historically low weighted average cost of capital, and then using those proceeds to either invest in the endowment to create what is termed endowment arbitrage, so yielding a return in the endowment, which is at least capable in part of cross-subsidizing the cost of the project, or investing in the institution itself to reorientate itself to offer higher value courses or to modernize the campus in a way that brings additional economic value to the institution beyond energy. So these larger value transactions are to a large degree driven by that need to realize upfront cash and to deploy that cash in higher value uses.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. And we'll talk a little bit later about how that cash is, to the extent that it's earmarked and really set for other uses, and where that $1 billion isn't necessarily all free money in those examples, or the $100 million that I know it sounds like we've heard from universities that the professors all decide it's time for a raise once they see the headline. So Russ, can you talk us through a little bit? Obviously, universities have a big range of important stakeholders. Again, not least the facilities and engineering staff that run those systems, as well as some of those that you've mentioned and that other panelists have mentioned: the students, the administration, the alumni. There's a large group to make sure you are addressing and serving the needs of. Can you talk about your approach in identifying and managing those stakeholders, how the engagement with the affected staff came about, and a little bit of a description of the system? I love these pictures on this slide about just the scale of these systems is really, really awesome. So Russ?
Sure. So yeah, we provided a few pictures of the plant. As I think you can see, even from these kind of smaller snapshots, it is quite an impressive facility. Again, well maintained, beautifully kept, spotless, clean. The picture on the upper left is the gas-fired turbine that generates 85% of the campus's electricity. But also produces, through this heat recovery system, some additional steam through the process that used to be waste at one point in time. But at any rate, so we think we had a pretty modern plant. I know Stephen was impressed the first time he toured it. But in terms of stakeholders, so keep in mind that this directive of monitoring opportunities to monetize campus assets came from our board, so the finance committee in particular, and so there wasn't a great sales pitch that needed to be made to those individuals. Obviously, on campus there were skeptics, facilities not the least of which obviously the employees of the plant. And then in terms of students and faculty, what we think happened there is over time, as the deal kind of came together, it was easy to really sell those constituents on the efficiency, resiliency, et cetera, of the deal, by tying these two plants together. With respect to the employees directly affected by the transaction, I would say that, I'm proud as a representative of Duquesne University, and I believe that Samir on the Clearway side, as we didn't even have a deal in hand, and we started to meet with our employees, and we would disclose to them, we had at least 3 major meetings along the way, and we disclosed to them the status of the deal, which was risky, right? We're talking about a deal that isn't even closed, but that's kind of the Duquesne University way, right? We wanted to make sure employees knew that we were thinking about them. We were doing everything that we could to take care of them. And so interestingly enough, as the deal came closer and closer to be, we found out, we had a union agreement in our plant and Clearway had a union agreement in their plant. So, and you can't, cross-homogenate those two deals. So we actually wanted, one thing we wanted to do was grandfather our employees' tuition remission benefit from the university. And we were told we weren't allowed to because of the competing union agreements, which seemed a shame, right? We want to offer this to our employees, but because the other plant employees didn't have it. We worked through that detail, but it was one of the things. And at the very end, when we were about to close, one of the proudest moments I had from an employee relations standpoint was that the 2 union reps were in a room with us, Clearway representatives, and they said, we have never gone through a transaction with such transparency and concern for the employees. They've never seen anything like it. So our employees were offered jobs by Clearway. More than 60% took the Clearway. The other 40 stayed at the university in another capacity. So everybody was taken care of, and we're proud of the way it was handled. And I think, the ones who took the leap to Clearway are probably doing better financially, honestly.
Thanks. And I have to say, having sat around the table with that was really a visual gathering of so many of those stakeholders, the buy-in was very apparent. There was not contention about whether this was going to happen. It was all about making sure all of the issues were addressed clearly. So that, to me, was evidence of a lot of advance work to talk through the process and what the value proposition was for the university. So there wasn't a debate about whether this was beneficial. It was more a debate about how to achieve that. So Samir, I know there was a unique benefit here in Duquesne because of an adjacent facility that Clearway already had in place. Do you want to talk about that for a moment?
Sure. Yeah. So, people always ask, why Duquesne and how do you kind of look at these deals? When we look at physical infrastructure of this type in a city, we literally look at a Google map. Because in many ways, the reason why the infrastructure is confined to, for this case, Duquesne University, is because that's not the business of what they're in terms of growing and interconnecting distributed generation infrastructure behind the grid. But Clearway is the second largest owner of these type of assets in the U.S. So when you think of the large steam systems in cities, I'm in New York City, that iconic scene of the steam coming out of the manhole covers kind of comes to mind. And similarly here in Pittsburgh, we have 2 district energy systems already. And as we looked at the fact that we had just built a brand new plant for UPMC, and next door, literally through a parking lot, sat Duquesne, we quickly realized that just simply by interconnecting the two, you would release technical value that could lead to economic value. And that was really the original idea that both Duquesne had and we had. We went into it saying, you've got excess capacity. We could use excess capacity because we're going to continue to grow in the city. You're not in the business of selling it, so let's see if we can do a deal. And through that, we essentially, did a deal where we that evolved to Russ's point. They realized that this is probably a business that is better in Clearway's hands because they saw a lot of the technical values. And then we ultimately ended up purchasing the plant and interconnecting the Duquesne plant with the UPMC plant. And now, if you think about both institutions, they're being supported by two assets instead of one asset. It's more resilient. The efficiency gains go up. You have what was being mentioned earlier in terms of the N+1 capacity that gets released. And so that interconnection now has been completed. And the story of these two transactions is now that the excess capacity that's being released by UPMC and Duquesne will now go to support the rest of the Pittsburgh downtown core. Last week, the city announced that they'll be transitioning one of the systems that they own that supplies downtown, that's, again, at the end of its life called PACT, over to Clearway. And the source to be able for us to support that system and provide energy will really be this. So from our standpoint, it's kind of standing back, looking at the city's infrastructure and trying to paint a picture over how you can optimize it. And there's kind of I'd say it's kind of like putting pieces of the puzzles together. And you hope that pieces of the puzzle together in a way that really maximizes the value and vision. And through this transaction, we've been able to do that after closing it. The next leg of the story just continues to evolve.
Great, thank you. And that UPMC, so that's part of the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. It's adjacent to Duquesne, but not a Duquesne facility. So it's Clearway that kind of provided the glue between those two to connect those two. So excellent. So let's talk about some of the deal, the economic fundamentals, and how this deal compared to some others. So we've identified a few different transactions and some of the key issues. Stephen, Samir, can the two of you walk us through kind of how this deal compared to others and maybe what drives some of the variation in these key terms?
Sure. Do you want me to go first, Samir? I'll go first. Yeah, so it's interesting, right? Because what we're seeing on this slide is four separate transactions of two of very large scale, Ohio State and Iowa State, and two of slightly more modest scale, University of Idaho and Duquesne. And I think, clearly there are commonalities, particularly the way in which the yearly payment escalates. The upfront payments are obviously very different. The way in which the transaction was structured, and in a way the purpose of the transaction. So at one end of the spectrum, you have Duquesne, which is an upfront payment driven by the sale of an asset and the monetization of surplus capacity in that asset, and that surplus capacity showing the capability of generating revenue from third parties and increasing performance efficiencies, and the net effect of all of that improvement being reflected in the monetization payment. Effectively, Duquesne holding its budget broadly stable, Clearway being able to generate more third-party revenue and reduce operating costs as compared to the status quo, and the delta between those two being effectively paid back to Duquesne upfront in rather simplistic terms. Iowa State is a very different beast, and we can see there that the monetization payment is considerably larger. Obviously, it's a larger institution and has a higher utilities budget regardless, but the payment of the university's operating budget is considerably higher. That, to some extent, reflects the fact that the Iowa State transaction was a much more explicit financing transaction. And this is all in public record, but the the whole purpose of the Iowa State transaction was to create a deal which could yield the largest possible upfront payment to the university. But it was primarily by leveraging budgets as far as reasonably to create debt capacity for the private sector to raise more capital against the operating budgets that were being given to them, that yearly payment, and then pass the value of that back to the university in an upfront payment. Up through the payment obligation, that escalation, the concessionaire to raise more debt, the fact that all future capital obligations, including decarbonization and down the line improvements, are in addition to the yearly payment. They are layered on top, meaning that the steep profile of payment obligations over time in return for that upfront payment. Now, that structure in part is driven by the university's confidence on the capital it's getting from the private sector in this deal versus its expected endowment returns, which is where most of this money is going. And the larger the delta between anticipated endowment returns and private sector cost of capital, the more the university felt capable of leveraging up its budgets. So where you have a predicted endowment return of 6, 7, 8% on average, and a private sector WACC of less than 4%, you can be more confident in that endowment arbitrage. If your endowment's yielding 5.5% on average, and you're borrowing at 4.5%, then clearly the margin for error is considerably lower, and that speaks to a more conservative transaction. So those are some of the dynamics that are in play across those deals. Samir, I'm sure you'll want to add stuff onto that.
Yeah, no, thank you, Stephen. I think the key thing, obviously, these deals are complex. The reasons for doing these deals can differ. Where these deals offer the maximum amount of value is that when they can be coupled with financial engineering along with technical engineering. You should be able to technically be doing something that is incrementally benefiting the institution, and that can pay dividends on top of the financial structuring, and that's coming from the finance guy on this call. So, and I think the opportunities to look at that and come up with technical engineering or technical value are unique and different to each city, to each geography, to each energy market under which these assets might be located. But what's important in terms of doing this deal is to have a process that allows for the industry to provide back technical value. Because if you simply go forth to do a financing transaction, then that's what it is. But it's really within the process allowing for technical excellence that can really lead it field to the best deals for the institution.
And just for clarification, there's an Iowa State and a University of Iowa deal. Was this one that we're describing here Iowa State or U of I?
Sorry, this is University of Iowa.
That's a typo. University
of Iowa. Okay. Because Iowa State is also looking at this. I just wanted to confirm. All right. Thank you. So, Russ and Samir, the credit agencies have looked at these as credit neutral to credit positive. Can you walk us through a little bit what some of the credit positive aspects of the deal were, and a little bit about how the documentation was pulled together? Russ, if you want to,
I'll take that one
kick
first.
That off.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we've covered a lot of this ground, but there are competing, facets of the deal, but highlighted by Moody's in their issuer comment letter, June 19, 2019. They like the large upfront payment. It improved a lot of the university's balance sheet ratios. Money is only as good as your your partner in the case of utilities. So there was much concern at the university, and certainly as Moody's evaluated the deal, obviously we're dead in the water if our utility plant isn't properly maintained, doesn't keep its up and running, status at 99.9% of the time. So, your partner is critical. Clearway has demonstrated, excellence in this area. So as we said, we got, deeper efficiency in terms of the staffing of the plant, the resiliency of the plants backing each other up, their track record of running these plants. And so I think what became apparent, even from a risk management standpoint at the university, as we looked at the deal, is you almost didn't realize how much risk, operational risk, you were assuming as a university running a standalone plant. But then then you worry about things like environmental and all of that. So there's a lot that goes into the deal. But again, Moody's, I think it's hard not to like our deal. I'm obviously playing favorites here, but because of the interconnection, we were able to untap the excess steam. We were able to untap the staffing efficiencies. We were able to untap the backup resiliency. And another thing that we didn't mention yet, I was going through my notes, and Samir, I know you'll remember this, but the water situation in downtown Pittsburgh, our rates have been, that infrastructure system has been mismanaged. So our water rates have been climbing, exponentially. Well, selling this plant to a private operator allowed them to get an industrial rate. That locked in another $250K of savings per year under the deal. So between all of the other staffing, excess steam, resiliency efficiencies, plus the water, we were over $1 million a year in savings from an operating standpoint, which in our view as the university basically offset any kind of a management fee or profit that Clearway, was going to pass through. So we felt that we were able to privatize and get all those operating benefits almost at no cost because of locking in these other efficiencies.
Yeah. No, and I would add, when we look at these transactions, and by the way, when we were working on the Duquesne transaction, there had only been one other transaction that had closed in the market, which was Ohio State. And we really had to think about, transaction, because it was different. The one thing I'll credit from Duquesne, I'll give credit to Duquesne for was they, you heard Russ say this, but their board said, go out there and get rid of non-core assets and get out of the businesses we don't belong in. To kind of get that done, and getting those marching orders is really hard out of institutions. What we find is institutions are simply just paralyzed. There's value there, and the indecision does not allow you to unlock it. Here we had a very forward-thinking institution in that when they looked at doing a deal, they didn't say, let's just go do the Ohio State deal. They said, we want to do the deal that's right for us. So we literally started with a blank sheet of paper and looked at where the value, discussed those with the rating agencies as well, and you kind of heard a few of these. So, releasing excess capacity, having more resilient assets by interconnecting them, having efficiencies in terms of how efficient your equipment is when you're interconnecting the two plants. All these things essentially stack on and add more and more value onto the transaction, the water rates. These are all technical in nature as I'm describing them. And so once you start putting that story together and you go to a rating agency and you say to them, yes, they like that, but here are all the business reasons of all the incremental value cash that you have to translate into cash for the school. We had to do this. The CFO said, what does that mean for me in terms of cash value? And you say to the rating agencies, these are all the values that a transaction like this unlocks. I think it's pretty powerful, and that was really what we heard from the rating agencies. And as we were discussing this transaction on a no-name basis, because we wanted to make sure when Duquesne got to those same rating agencies to discuss it, they understood everything that was happening. And to be frank with you, we understood how they would view it. And, the rating agencies, in large part, look at these transactions as being credit neutral to positive. to these transactions. And I think you're going to start seeing, you're going to see a lot more of this style of transaction space, but they are complex to achieve.
Thank you, Samir. Yeah, Russ, did you want to add something?
Darin can. Sure, I think it's been said, but I think this is a good point to repeat it. You mentioned that, it was our board that charged this type of a transaction, but it was also our board who also restricted the proceeds. We certainly endorsed that plan in the finance office. We didn't, you don't sell assets to fund operations. So we sold the asset and we put the proceeds completely into the university's endowment. That's key, or otherwise, you're literally just selling assets, and spending the money. And that's it's a complex transaction. So that's a difficult message to your campus, particularly, to faculty. They saw this great big gain in our financial statements, but the reality was that money needed to be invested to, in effect, help pay for the cost of privatizing the plant. And Moody's saw that aspect. It was amazing to me how on our first call, within the first 5 minutes, they basically said, oh, okay, so this is an arbitrage play. There was no mystery in the deal, other than we did. The other comment that I'll make at this point is, and Stephen and ENY was involved in this, we went to great lengths to have this as an off-balance sheet transaction. So I think I was quoted from a prior workshop. My thinking was everybody needs energy, right? We're not open for business without electricity, chilled water, and steam. And if we were buying that from a provider, we wouldn't put a 40-year liability on our balance sheet, for the next 40 years worth of energy that we're buying. And so why should there be a liability associated with this? So we structured the deal as a true sale, meeting all the accounting requirements. So I just mentioned that here because we've gotten calls from other schools who have been contemplating transactions and certainly worry about the economics of the transaction first. But we were actually worried about the accounting treatment the whole way through. And I know in some of the calls that we've taken from other schools, they hadn't even thought about the accounting treatment. They were just, focusing on the economics of the deal. And I'm not here to say that accounting should trump economics, but it does matter. It certainly does matter. So that's all.
Thank you. That's a perfect segue, actually. Stephen, we've got a change in lease accounting rules, which makes the accounting treatment continually getting more complex under both the FASB and GASB, and getting that off-balance sheet treatment becomes a little more challenging. So again, both how important was this, but also how did you go about from a financial advisory standpoint, looking at the balance of these issues? So you have cost of capital, quality of risk transfer versus bankability. You transfer too much risk, it makes it tough to bank to get financing. You transfer not enough, then you wonder why you did the deal from the sponsor's perspective, from the university or the healthcare facility. And it affects the cost of the debt, which obviously is a key part of the transaction. So, can you speak a little bit to the accounting rules issue and the risk transfer? And I know Russ and Samir, you may have some things to add to that as well. But Stephen, if you could start that with the off-balance sheet question.
Sure, absolutely. And it's a bit of a tightrope walk, to be honest. Now, I think if you account under GASB, if you're a government accounting entity, so state institution, then the concept of getting things off balance sheet is virtually impossible under latest guide public-private partnership. So that's kind of one set of rules which are very, very hard to deal with. So I just kind of park that side for the moment. If you're a FASB accounting entity, so a private institution, pitfalls that you could potentially trip over. One is how to account for the energy services agreement and whether or not that falls into a lease accounting rule book. And if it's under the new rules, all leases are on balance sheet, all have to be treated as a long-term liability. So if you, what makes that particularly unappealing is that Russ said utilities from a supplier under a utility supply contract, and you continue to do that from someone like Clearway, but now you have to account for a 40-year liability. That seems highly unpleasant and not entirely rational. So you can, there are ways to deal with that, but fundamentally you have to transfer enough risk to the private sector to make it clear that you are no longer effectively leasing the asset from the private sector counterparty. And the other way you have to deal with that is you can't be the sole off-taker of energy. So as the university and the contractor between them need to really account for no more than 90% of the economic value of the output of the assets. So third-party customers are extremely important to that lease accounting outcome. But that's only part of the transaction. The other part of the transaction is how to account for the monetization payment. And that is trickier, again, because there are a whole set of other rules around whether something is a true sale, as in have you sold an asset and are receiving cash for that asset, or are you doing this is this effectively a financing transaction and not a true sale? So there's a whole bunch of other rules there. And one of the key things that a university needs to get its head around is, unlike a public-private partnership, if you want to avoid a true sale, if you want to get a true sale accounting treatment, you can't have an automatic right of asset reversion at the expiry of the contract. Otherwise, that is, if you have that, then that's strong indicative evidence that you haven't really sold the asset. So there are ways to deal with that, and we did that in Duquesne, but you kind of have to get through, if you want this really properly off balance sheet, i.e. no liability for the ESA, and de-recognize the assets, you have to basically get through both of those hurdles. Now, others have effectively got the ESA off balance sheet, but chosen what's called an advanced lease payment structure for the monetization payment. So they effectively gross up their balance sheets. They recognize a liability for the monetization payment, but then recognize the cash as well. So it's broadly balance sheet neutral, but not truly off balance sheet. So as you can tell, there's a ton of complexity there.
And these are going to be a lot of issues that you come across on renewable energy transactions where there are sales or power purchase agreements or tax equity investors that need to be carefully treading as to who the owner is for tax purposes. So these are accounting purposes rather than tax per se, although they have tax implications, obviously. But so parties that may have been have dealt with this on the renewable side, they're going to run into some very familiar issues, I think. And I would just point out that the Duquesne arrangement here had some real unique structures in terms of how the capex charge was passed through, how the university was willing to take on that risk over time. I think it helped to have it set on a 5-year budget. And Russ, as we were talking before, I think you noted that there's the potential for financing that if you had an unexpectedly large capex expenditure at a particular point in time, but that there's really an ability to smooth that out over time. So taking on that risk was something you had already been doing, and I think the university got comfortable with that. So that's a little bit different. And I think the Clearway taking on the O&M risk over the life of that services agreement was also an important risk transfer process for both the university and for Clearway. I'd also add that it was very helpful on the advisory side to have all of the parties around the table during the negotiations. So there were people representing the private placement market and the financing to make sure we were sensitive to those issues as they came about, so there weren't any late-breaking surprises. I think in terms of, we do need to wrap it up, and we're going to be moving to a mic. For those who have who've registered for this, we have a little more free-flowing two-way dialogue through a Microsoft Teams platform. You should have an invitation to that. We'll mention that in just a moment, but I really wanted to kind of close. I think we've really touched on most of the risks in one way or another, but really just to emphasize that these are not cookie cutter deals, and the key issues of risk considerations and concerns can be addressed in a lot of different ways among the parties, and that's where the real discussions, I think, come about. In terms of, we've mentioned the availability and operation and maintenance risk. We talked a little bit about the financing risks, that you get that financing obtained, and this to kind of future-proof operations and make sure you have redundancy and professionalism. So I think I would just emphasize that part of the risks that we have, and would wrap it up with that. And it's an exciting area that we see a lot more things happening. So looking forward to further discussions. Thanks. Maggie?
Thanks, Darin. Thank you so much for attending our webinar. Our panelists will now be heading to Microsoft Teams to address any questions that were asked and not answered during our presentation, as well as questions that might come to mind now for them to take a deeper dive. If you have chosen to attend the Microsoft Teams meeting, please access the meeting via the calendar invite that was sent to you directly from me. But if you would like to attend and did not receive a calendar invite, please email me at mweschler@foley.com. And that's WESCHLER, and I will forward that to you shortly. Thank you so much, everybody, and we will see you on Teams shortly.